Today we'll be talking about Chapter 11, Section 4, and it's called The North Takes Charge. We'll be talking about several key victories. One for the South that led to an invasion of the North. And then perhaps the most pivotal battle of the entire Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg. And so we're going to begin this lesson by looking at the build-up towards the most climactic battle of the war. And we're going to start with Chancellorsville. If you watch the movie Gods and Generals, excellent film. It follows the early parts of the war leading up to the Battle of Gettysburg, which in the 1980s there was a great movie made called Gettysburg. It's extremely long, so we're not going to watch it. 4 to 5 hours. So we can't watch it in here. But it does contain an excellent recreation of some of these battles. Well, if you remember where we are in the war at this point, Robert E. Lee has attempted one invasion of the North, and it was repelled at the bloodiest day in American history known as Antietam. 28,000 men lost their lives on that day, 26,000. And the South was forced to retreat. Meanwhile, Robert E. Lee prepares for another invasion. Several other battles have happened up to this point. The North has suffered disastrous defeats at Fredericksburg, where they tried to force march troops up a hill to take an entrenched Confederate position, and they were slaughtered. But then, the South saw yet another opportunity to invade. And it began with a decisive Confederate victory at Chancellorsville. The South defeated the North in a surprise attack. In fact, the Southern Army swept into the Union camp. And much like Bull Run, the North was caught unprepared and retreated in a rout. And it was chaos. Southern troops marching in, yelling and screaming, and Northern troops rushing to get away in a literal traffic jam, bottleneck to try to escape. And it was considered a decisive Southern victory, paving the way for an invasion of the North. And so here we are again, 3 years into the war, into a war that many thought would only last a couple of months. And now the South is once again invading the North. And we're almost into election season in 1863. And George McClellan is beginning to claim that Abraham Lincoln is a tyrant. He is stripping us of our civil liberties in an unjust war, and it's time that we get out of it. And he's going to run against Abraham Lincoln on a peace ticket and nearly win. During the Battle of Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson was out one evening on patrol, one of the South's most famous generals. He was surveying the entrenchments and defenses that had been dug, and he was accidentally shot by a sentry. One of his own men shot Stonewall Jackson in the arm. And we learned about Civil War medicine and how primitive and kind of barbaric it was. Well, they removed Stonewall Jackson's arm to try to save his life, but the infection from the bullet set in, and he died of pneumonia a few days later. So Lee decided to invade the North, partly to get supplies for a beleaguered army, partly to demonstrate to the North that the South was still capable of launching an invasion. This would be a huge political win if the Confederacy can just maintain a presence in Union states for a period of time. That's all they have to do to convince Northern people that not only can the South repel an invasion, but they can launch one of their own. And then Gettysburg. So after Chancellorsville, the Confederacy marches through Maryland, a slave state. Maryland threw a parade for the Confederate armies as they marched through Baltimore. Can you imagine? So the Confederate Army invades, beginning with Baltimore, and they throw the Confederate Army a parade. Confederate Army marches through Maryland unopposed. But then they get up to Pennsylvania. Can you imagine? The Confederacy has now gotten into Pennsylvania. They've invaded that far. There's a small town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. There were a number of stores in the town. And ironically, this battle, the most decisive battle in the entire war, started because of a shoe store. I kid you not. There was a shoe store in Gettysburg. I can't imagine how many of these soldiers had been marching barefoot. But if you've ever walked around barefoot for very long, all you think about is, man, I need some shoes. And these soldiers raided a shoe warehouse to get basic supplies. So they go into the town, they start looting the town for supplies, and they found Union soldiers stationed there. And so like any other battle, it began with a skirmish where these handful of soldiers looting the town fight with these handful of Union soldiers stationed there. What both sides were unaware of was that each of the main armies were camped out outside of this town, the town of Gettysburg. Each of the main forces, all 120,000 of the Army of the Potomac, camped just on the other side of the town where all 80,000 of the Confederate Army were at that time. And so this turned into a huge battle. Now, the first day of the battle, July 1st of 1863, the Confederates actually drove the Union out of the town. Because the Union this wasn't a strategic stronghold. It was a small town with a handful of stores and a shoe store that ironically started it all. And so they retreated. They had no orders to hold the town forcefully. But they entrenched themselves outside of the town. And so I want to show you. And here's day one, July 1st, 1863. You see the Confederate armies encroaching upon the town, the Union armies stationed outside of the town, and then by the end of the day, Union retreats and entrenches. So what began as a series of skirmishes, a skirmish is where you send in a handful of people to probe, saying, hey, Long, go check out that tree over there. We all sit back and watch. Is the monster going to get him? Okay. Oh, that was awful! Oh, God, the humanity! Hey, Jordan, go check out that other tree.
No, not small.
Oh, God, they ripped his head off! Oh, you know. Okay, all right, enough of that. We're all going to hide over here now. Skirmishes went very badly. But aren't you glad it was just Long and Jordan instead of all of you? How bad would it have been if I'd said, okay, go take that tree! Woo! Oh, God, it's awful. They're all dead. The monster got them all. No, we're just going to send a couple probes in. That's a skirmish anyway. You know, hey, there's that shoe store. Dude, there's like 10,000 of us that are barefoot. Yeah. Hey, Chase, go see if it's empty. Hey, Ben, you serve as lookout. I'm sick of being barefoot. We're getting some shoes. Come on. So anyway, what began as a skirmish, we wound up finding not just the monster, but the Union Army. The entire Union Army camped out in this town. So anyway, day one ends with the Union Army evacuating the town, realized that it was more strategic for them to set up on these high points, Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and the Peach Orchard here. And so they set up in more defensible positions instead of fighting street to street. Point. So the Union has now taken up defensive positions along the high tops. In a case like this, in a 3-day battle, officers will still try to cycle soldiers out of the most intense part of the fighting to give them a break now and then. But as we lead up to day 2 of the battle, there's inconclusive fighting around the high points as the Confederate armies try to take the high points. To ill effect, they're driven back. But the battle is decided on the third day, July 3rd of 1863. It begins with bombardments from both sides, but the Confederacy orders, Robert E. Lee orders his men to prepare for a full-scale assault. This is known as Pickett's Charge. So anytime you're going to order a full-scale assault, we're no longer just sending Jordan and Chase in to check it out. At this point, we've already done the skirmishes. That was the battle leading up to this point. We are now ready to issue a full charge. So I just want you to imagine this. You're a soldier. You're carrying about 50 pounds of gear on your back. 50 pounds. That's heavy. You also have your rifle, and whatever you're carrying with you, that's what you have. Now, General Lee has ordered you to take Cemetery Ridge. At this point, the Union has had a few days to entrench their position. That means they've dug ditches. They are now hiding behind them. They are making use of any existing fortifications. There were places where there were stone walls Union troops were stationed behind, wooden fences they were stationed behind. They now have cannons pulled up, ready for this charge. Now the charge is going to take place across a mile of open ground. That means that you and your comrades, who are now in pretty good shape by this point because you do lots of marching and drills of this manner, you are prepared for this. Imagine you can physically do this. You've now been ordered to charge across a mile of open ground. Now you're not at a dead sprint. You're at about half pace, so a trot. So you're like this, with 50 pounds of gear, okay? And then, when the order to charge comes, and it's not going to come until you're about 50 yards away from the enemy, you're going to break into a dead spread and try to clear the gap. Because when you enter a certain point, you're in rifle range. And that's the real killer. Because all the way that mile leading up to it, you're in artillery range. That means every now and then the Union gets a lucky shot and 5 of your buddies die next to you. But otherwise, in Pickett's charge, the entire Confederate Army is going to charge across this mile of open ground. Doesn't look quite so glamorous on the screen, I know. But that's Pickett's charge. 15,000 men died in that one engagement. Across a mile of open ground. This was considered the breaking point, really. And just to recap some of what we've already seen. On the second day, the South attacked the Union. The North repulsed them. The Union line held. And the third day was the day of that Pickett's charge. And many felt this is where the Confederates lost the war, because these losses could not be replaced. And the end result of the third day was that the Army of Virginia was forced to retreat with staggering losses. So what you're seeing is a painting recreating the battle. And while effectively you could argue that the war was decided here because these losses were irreplaceable. After this, the Confederacy was forced to retreat. The Union's going to be on the advance for the rest of the war. The South's no longer going to try to invade. They're simply going to try to hang on as long as they could, and the war would be over in about a year after this point. But to be fair, Fredericksburg was the opposite. The Union advanced on an entrenched Confederate position, suffered roughly the same losses, trying to force their way up a hill, while the Confederates are behind a wall. But the difference, and really the big difference in this war, is that the Union could replace these men. They had the larger army. They had the better resources. And that's the long story of this war, that sometimes you get dramatic battles like this. But largely it was a war of resources. And the wealthier side won. The next major battle we need to talk about is the town of Vicksburg. In the western part of the Confederacy, it was the Union's job to try to take every town along the Mississippi River. Every single one had to fall. Vicksburg was the last to hold out. Because as long as Vicksburg held, a link between the Eastern and Western Confederacy was maintained. Ships crossing the Mississippi could be protected from the cannon emplacements on that town, and the West could continue to supply the East with troops and food and munitions. By the spring of 1863, the Union had destroyed all rail lines in the state of Mississippi. The city of Jackson, Mississippi had been sacked by Union forces. Grant's assaults on Vicksburg had failed. It was one of the most entrenched towns in the United States, one of the best fortified towns in the United States. The Union forces could not take this town. And so they chose instead to resort to the oldest form of warfare, the siege. The Union surrounded the town and prepared for the long siege. They dug in and prepared to starve them out. And eventually, and it is ironic perhaps, that one day after Gettysburg, the town of Vicksburg surrendered. Starving soldiers within the town eventually approached their officer and demanded that he surrender the fort. Or perhaps they would kill him and surrender themselves. Starvation will break an enemy with time. 5 days later, Port Hudson also fell, and now Mississippi is completely Union hands. And now the Confederacy is divided in two. And so here's a painting of Vicksburg. You see the entrenched positions, the high top, here's the Mississippi, and here are the Union forces committed to starving them out. Now, sometimes I struggle to teach about wars, because while they can make for exciting stories, it's hard to talk about the deaths of so many. And it's hard to talk about such a terrible thing, where citizens of the same country have now committed such violent acts against one another. It does beg the question, why? Why did we do this? What is this all about? You know, I ask that when I sprain my ankle. I mean, surely we're going to ask that when 500,000 people die, right? And after the Battle of Gettysburg, this just terrible, 29,000 people died in that battle. I mean, what is it all about? And Abraham Lincoln comes to the battlefield in the same year, in the month of November, to just say a few words. Because the battlefield is now a cemetery. They actually buried many of the men where they lie. And so, to commemorate the Gettysburg Cemetery, The President of the United States got up to say a few words. Now, no one knows who Edward Everett was, but he was actually the keynote speaker at this engagement. He got up and knocked them dead for 2 long hours, said just everything that everybody was feeling, had them in tears, they were rolling on the ground, they were cheering, just Edward Everett laid it down. And then here comes President Lincoln, who really people aren't sure about this guy. I mean, there's a significant campaign against him to end the war. And he gets up and he talks for 2 minutes. And those 2 minutes are now called the Gettysburg Address. We consider it to be one of the most important speeches in American history, and I'm going to share it with you. I don't have it all memorized, but I can quote large chunks of it. I need to memorize the whole thing. I think if there's one speech you should commit to memory, it's this one. But let me share it with you.
Fourscore-and-7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
After Gettysburg, after Vicksburg, the Confederacy was on the losing side of this war. The South no longer had the power to attack. All they could really do was hope to hold out long enough, to draw this war out long enough that the North would eventually decide it wasn't worth it. There was a powerful peace movement in the South as well. We have to remember that most of these battles were fought on Southern soil. It was devastating. There was quite a bit of discord within Jefferson Davis's own government. The Articles of Confederation, remember, were a terrible idea because no laws could be binding on all of the states without unanimous consent, and there was no effective way of enforcing laws at the federal level. Jefferson Davis had the same problem with the Confederate States of America, and so he was never able to govern quite effectively. Meanwhile, in March of 1864, the same man who gave that powerful speech, who said that this country of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth, the same man who said that is going to back it up decisively. Lincoln appointed Ulysses S. Grant commander of all Union armies, who authorized Grant to appoint William Tecumseh Sherman to invade the South and punish it for rising up against the North. Both commanders believed that total war was necessary to defeat the South. Total war. I don't know if you understand what total war is. Again, throwing everything at the enemy, but also not just killing soldiers, but men, women, children, burning things, looting, pillaging, absolute destruction. That's total war. And these commanders believed that was necessary to end this war, because these commanders believed it wasn't just the soldiers who rose up. It was the people, and the people had to be punished. I just wanted to show you this man. This is the man who gave the order to rape, loot, and pillage cities like Atlanta and Columbia. This is Ulysses S. Grant, the most effective Union general in the entire war. He would later become President of the United States. He was a failure in everything except being an officer. He was an alcoholic. He was an abusive husband. He was pretty much worthless in life, but he was good at war. He was good at killing, and that's what we needed him for. They called him the Butcher because he was so good. He was willing to put men in harm's way to get a very awful job done and to win this war. Now, Grant's strategy was to tie up the main Confederate army in Virginia. I just want you to think about that. His strategy was to just continue to throw troops at Grant. Didn't matter how many died, didn't matter what, but just to tie up the main Confederate army, to distract them while Sherman burned his way through the South. It was said that Sherman's army left a wake like a tornado. They were told to rip up, to burn, to kill, to murder, to do whatever they wanted. An angry army was set loose on the people because that's what Sherman believed. You remember him? He was the man who at the beginning of this war said, "I am convinced this country will be bathed in blood, that the South will not surrender, that this country will not be saved without a mighty effort." That's the same man. Both sides suffered heavy losses in this campaign, but the point is the North could afford to replace them, but the South could not. Here's an example of trench warfare in the Civil War. Tens of thousands dead, but again the North could replace them, and were willing to. Sherman's strategy here was to destroy the will of the South to fight. But in order to do this, he would have to do unspeakable things. By September of 1864, Sherman's armies had taken the city of Atlanta and set it afire. One of the largest cities in the South had been burned to the ground. The South tried to stop him by cutting his supply lines, hoping that would force him to bog down in the city of Atlanta. Sherman, meanwhile, told his armies to live off the land, to steal, loot, and pillage. By December, Sherman's armies had made their way into Savannah. The city of Savannah was set on fire by Sherman's armies. And then he turns north to help Grant fight Lee and burns the capital of South Carolina to the ground. Again, just everywhere, this was a murdering force. So I want you to understand that both sides did terrible things. You know, we always say Nazis bad, sure, but does anybody know about Dresden? Anybody ever heard of the bombing of the city of Dresden? Men, women, children burned to death by the British. Again, I'm not apologizing for the Nazis. I'm just letting you know that in war, terrible things are done by both sides. So here's an old woodcut drawing of Sherman's troops marching to the sea was the plan. Here's a photograph even of Sherman's troops ripping up railroads, destroying everything as they go through. Meanwhile, Sherman had taken Savannah by the end of the year in 1864. Lincoln was under a lot of pressure here because 1864 was an election year, and a lot rode on this election. So sure, a lot rides on this election, and I don't want to discount that. But in the election of 1864, the continuation of the war was in question. McClellan wanted to end the war. He said, it's not worth it. Forget about it. Lincoln said, we have to finish the job. I need a few more months, and this will all be over. That was Lincoln's election strategy. It really helped him that by September of 1864, I mean, here we are just into September, right? How much election stuff do you hear constantly, right? And September of 1864, Sherman took Atlanta. And now Lincoln can say one of their biggest cities has fallen. Eventually, these Union victories are going to give Lincoln the win, but it was a narrow one. I want to point it out. Notice that Southern states obviously were not allowed to vote in the election because they're not part of the country in 1864. But let's look at the popular vote. 2,213,000 people voted for Lincoln, roughly 55% of the popular vote. 45% of Americans felt the war should be ended immediately. 45% of Americans were over this and wanted it over now. Now, obviously, as you can see with the electoral vote, it wasn't enough to carry many states, but the popular vote here is very significant. But nonetheless, Lincoln won the election. It would take another year of terrible fighting. Another 100,000 dead. Eventually, Jefferson Davis would flee Richmond, Virginia. He would order the city to be set afire, and Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Virginia at Appomattox Courthouse in April of 1965. The conditions of this were that Lee's soldiers would be set free, but the South would now have to be under control of the Union, and that will be known as Reconstruction. We'll be talking about it more in the next few days. It is important to note that Lincoln did not want a vindictive peace. He wanted a restoration of our country as quickly as possible. But yeah, here's the famous signing to end the war at Appomattox Courthouse.